We talk a lot about the right climate policies, such as carbon pricing, but there's a step before all of that: politics. Because you need politicians to carry out these policies. And who gets elected is decided by voters and their preferences, as well, of course, as the position of politicians. And these are likely to change when the climate gets hotter and the economy starts to transition. So, today's episode, we'll tackle these topics in the context of climate policy in the United States. In particular, you will be able to answer the following questions at the end of the episode. When a place experiences unusually extreme heat, does that measurably shift votes? Second, how do local green and brown jobs shape climate politics? And third, how do those forces influence the probability of future climate legislation being enacted? And my guest today is Professor Matilde Bombardini, and we're discussing her working paper, Climate Politics in the United States. And Matilda holds the Oliver E. and Dolores W. Williamson Chair in Economics of Organizations and is Professor of Business and Public Policy at UC Berkeley Haas, and she's affiliated with the NBER, the BFI's IOG Group, and the Center for Economic Policy Research. So let's dive in. Matilda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am very excited, as I said. We've covered the impacts of climate change, how to most cost effectively, work on it through cap and trade. But this is like the first one analyzing climate policy of like what drives it from a voter behavior. So maybe just to start off, could you then maybe talk about what got you interested in this project and what you were trying to do?
Sure. So I guess I should start by saying that the thought that voters react to climate shocks is not, we're not the first to think about this. And so there's other papers that look at, for example, the effect of climate shocks on beliefs, and uses survey data to measure that. But really, what's unique about this paper is that we have really comprehensive data about voting. So it's not just about how people's beliefs react to climate change, but it's really their actions, which at the end of the day, that's what translates into who we elect and all that. So and so we wanted to understand, how various parts of climate adaptation and climate change affect voters' sort of behavior and politicians' behavior, because you can think of voters as sort of the demand side of the political market, and sort of politicians are on the supply side. They supply policies and so on. And so the occasion came when one of the co-authors on the paper, Nicolas Longuet-Marx, had completed his collection of data for the US, and I'll go into that a little bit later, but sort of gave us very, very granular data in the US. And so we could ask the type of questions that we're interested in, sort of like climate change itself is sort of weather shocks, but then you also have climate transition, and so sort of the change in the labor markets that are associated with climate, the transition. And so we could measure all those at a very granular level, and then be satisfied with the answer in a way that will become clear as we discuss.
I think that's the really interesting part of your paper. It's not just looking at voter preferences, but also how politicians react to that. Because it's a demand and supply side market. Something I don't think people always fully capture, that it's like the both tendencies working.
Yeah, because the important part is that if you get the voters' reaction, you're kind of linked. You're very constrained to an inevitably very short run effect, because you react given the current what's out there in terms of policy positions out there, the politicians that are out there at the moment. But we know that politicians will adjust. So, so if we want to go past the immediate short run, then we have to think about and do projections on how policy is likely to evolve in the future. Then we need both sides, right? And so our general sort of inspiration came from these very, I'm sure you've talked about it on your podcast, these integrated assessment models, which sort of do the whole loop of you have the economics, and then you have sort of, you have some policies, you have firms' decision, they produce a certain amount of stuff, and it produces emissions that then cause more climate change, and this starts over again. But what was missing is really the link between sort of, emissions cause higher temperatures and different precipitation and so on. And at that point, you have some effects that people can see. And so we were missing that part of like, what's the political reaction that then kind of moves policy in a certain direction. So that block is kind of missing in these integrated assessment models at the moment. And so hopefully this kind of gives some way of modeling that part.
And I think it's a very good point because there's two main measures you look at. One is these extreme temperature shocks, and then the other one like part of the economy they work in. But for example, we had some really hot weeks in Europe this year, and immediately you see, and you immediately it's like, look at all these costs. The forest fires. Like people become very aware. I think it's just people who've just been through the summer. It's a lot more salient. So could you maybe speak to like what the measures are used for extreme temperature and like why that would influence the voter behavior?
Absolutely, and I kind of want to sort of reinforce the fact that yes, when you're experiencing that hot weather, you immediately, if you ask people, in fact, there's strong evidence that if you ask people the day after, then they have, oh my God, climate change is the worst problem that we're facing. But we wanted to check if that persists when you actually go and vote. Okay, so and so that was the part that I wasn't so convinced about. So yeah, the measure that we have. So we experiment with different measures, but we want to capture sort of temperature variation and precipitations. And so we look at both absolute measures of whether it's a hot or a particularly cold day. But also we construct, and that's the main measure we converged on, which is sort of construct a sort of extraordinarily hot relative to what's usually in that area, right? So as there's parts of Europe that are always hot, so we're trying to capture unusually hot days, and so that's 2 standard deviations above the historical average in that day. And so we count the number of days in a year where you pass this threshold, both in terms of temperatures and precipitations.
And because it's true, like it's really hot now, and then we get to winter, and then if you go vote, it's like this: does the effect persist? But it seems like you weren't sure, but I don't know if your paper convinced yourself that it persists, or is not as much, or
at the end of the day, there are effects. We will find, we do find them. I mean, these are as good as it's going to get in terms of data quality for the US, and this is as disaggregated as possible. And I guess I'd like to spend a minute sort of describing that. When I talk about granular data, what I mean is the unit of which you vote, which is a precinct. It's the school that you go and vote, right? So that's true in Europe as well. In the US, that's about 1,200 people. And so there are about 400 of them in a congressional district. And again, the congressional district is the sort of the single member district in the United States. For those that are in Europe, at which you elect your congressperson. Okay, so and so we have previous other papers kind of tend to do analysis. I mean, in the US, there's not much, but even in Europe, these are more sort of at an aggregate level. And so, if we only had congressional district or a unit that's bigger, let's say like a county, then it would be very hard to do the demand and supply analysis that we do, right? So, but why? Because now what we can do is that we can look within a congressional district across these precincts, and we can compare 2 locations within a congressional district that have different numbers of hot days, holding constant who the politician is, and therefore all their different characteristics. So, whether they're more left-leaning or right-leaning and so on. So we're really purely comparing these units that are pretty small as it's going to get, right? You cannot get individual level voting data, knowing who they voted for, right? I mean, you can get individual voting data. I mean, there are some other papers out there right now that use individual voting data, but you don't know who they voted for. You only know whether they voted or not and whether they're registered Democrat or Republican. But then you only have a turnout decision. But anyways, that's a separate issue.
Yeah, I think it's really emphasizing just how granular your data is. I think I was very impressed. Like you really have this long period of data on a very micro level of voting behavior. Because as you said, politicians are complex people. They have they have stances on a wide variety of things, which is now something you can, filter out, like what's their position on climate change, which is really impressive the way you did it.
I should take zero credit for this. This is all our young co-author, Nicolas Longuet-Marx, who is going to join Berkeley next year and is currently a postdoc at Stanford. And he is the one that, in his job market paper, collected and put together this data, which, if you think about it, it shouldn't be so hard to get, right? I mean, this for the United States, but because elections, as you may know, are run at the state level or the county level, data collection, the data collection could be done even at the county level. So you had to collect from sometimes hundreds of sources, all these, and then kind of put them together. So it requires a certain amount of perseverance. And then the other thing that he collected was the positions of politicians. So again, this is all in his job market paper. So now we're kind of piggybacking on that and using, kind of finding a new application of it. The other important source of data is the policy position, right? And so what he did was to look at both surveys that are run on candidates and their website, their platforms. And so using both together in a way that is more detailed in the paper, it manages to construct their policy position in a variety of dimensions, so cultural, economic, and environmental. And so, and this is really his sort of job market paper doing that. But it's amazing that he can get the positions of both candidates, because we have a lot of good ways to measure the positions of politicians, but they're usually incumbents, meaning those who got elected and they vote. And so because they vote, we can see the vote and we can infer what's the position. But this is before they get elected. And so to get the other competitor, to get the both sort of candidates, then you need something else. And that's what it used.
Yeah, exactly. Then, because that's the one thing you also mentioned, is exactly the way they market themselves in the race is also then generally how they tend to vote. So there's actually it's a credible signal.
I'm glad you noticed that, because some people, they jump immediately and say, well, this is just what they say. Of course they're going to vote differently once they're in office. No, actually, this is a really good predictor of the actual vote. So we take that as a sort of pretty good measure of their policy stance.
Exactly. And then the one other measure you looked at is the green jobs and brown jobs.
Yes.
Maybe if you could...
Yes. So at the same level of sort of granularity, we can measure sort of these are, you could measure the cost of transition in many ways, the costs and opportunities of green transition in many ways. But we thought that the more straightforward way was to build a measure of how many people are going to lose their job and how many people are going to win jobs, right? And so now it turns out that measuring brown jobs is pretty straightforward. We actually just measure oil, gas, and coal jobs, and those are very easy to measure. When you want to measure green jobs, we could spend a good half hour kind of describing all the different ways in which you do, but we ended up sort of trying to capture the idea that these are jobs related to green transition, electrification, renewables. So it's not just wind and solar, but it's more generally sort of increasing replacing the grid, the power grid, and sort of improving infrastructure, and a variety of ancillary jobs. So this is sort of, we're following the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
And I can really recommend people, first of all, to check the working paper, because in the working paper you have got some great graphs where you show this visually. I might even just put it in the transcript, because then I provide a transcript, because I think that you can clearly see, Texas is, it's the logical thing where a lot of this oil and gas is just more brown jobs, and they're more at risk of losing when there's stronger regulation. So naturally, there's just more concern there in those regions. I think we've covered data, unless there's always more to say, of course, but then, because then the rest of your paper is kind of split up into three more parts. First is, how does the extreme weather events and the green and brown jobs influence voting behavior? I'm just painting a picture here for the listener. Second is then how does that influence politicians? And then three, the projections. So maybe we could just start with the impacts on voter behavior of these two things.
Yes. So the main result is when you measure the number of extreme days, in the way that we discussed, an extra standard deviation in this measure, which is about equivalent to about 8 days of these excessively high temperature, increases the Democratic vote margin by about 0.66 percentage points. So if you were at 50, it goes to 50.66. And the number of days of extremely high precipitation increases it by a little less. And overall, the precipitation numbers are less robust overall. And so, but it's about half of that. So it's about 0.35 percentage points. So together, let's say a standard deviation in these two increases by about 1 percentage point. And so, a 1 percentage point can be in a marginally, in a competitive election, significant. And now, in terms of green jobs, so we find that we find when we measure the importance of green jobs and brown jobs, and we measure it in terms of percentage, when there's an increase in 1 standard deviation in the share of green jobs, it increases Democratic vote margin by about zero point 0.2 percentage points, whereas a standard deviation increase in brown job share reduces Democratic margin by about zero point 0.6 percentage points. So again, the magnitudes are comparable, and these are quite economically sizable, although they're not gigantic. But there are many things that affect voting behavior, so you wouldn't expect these to be. Mhm.
Because on the temperature one, it's almost, if I take 1 week of these extreme temperatures, because I think you said 8 days,
Right.
then that's about 0.66%, which is sizable in a close election. That can really make a difference. And then it's also like the way you said, like the brown jobs, as you would expect, they just have the more people care about their jobs, then the more that has an impact
And
as well.
we try to contextualize this with comparison to other determinants of voting, and we have this number that may not be so familiar to those who are in Europe, but Fox News exposure in terms of minutes. So the equivalent of 1 standard deviation in these extreme day temperature is about 2.5 extra minutes of exposure to Fox News. Now, these effects are large. So, the reason why it says it's only 2.5 minutes, because those estimates are very large, and that's comes from other
Okay.
papers, and we have no control over that.
Yeah. It's like when I read the paper, I was like 2.5 minutes of Fox News. But I mean, I imagine the average Democrat doesn't watch a lot of Fox News, so it's just at the margin it can be a huge influence. So,
That's right.
but exactly, I
That's
like
right.
that comparison. Um,
And we also compare it to partisan advertising. So if you have a standard deviation in advertising has a similar
in
effect.
the beginning, you said something about persistence. Is this then a persistent shock? I don't remember anything in the paper, so I'm not sure if this is the relevant question to ask. But
No, that's a great point. No, what I meant was that I don't know if you when it persists in the sense that you experience it today, but if you go vote next
yeah,
year, do you even remember how many
yeah, yeah,
days
yeah.
there
Okay,
have
got
been?
it.
So
Yeah,
in that sense, there's no
got it.
persistence.
Okay,
Yeah.
then
Yes.
I think then it's also some of the really interesting things is then how that shapes the position of politicians. So because we've got climate
Yes.
change happening. I think most people listen. I mean, I just would assume everybody listening to this podcast, generally agrees that it's happening. Um, but then we just see more of these days. So generally, people over time would vote more for Democrats who've got a position. But then you show some really interesting things, which is the supply side of this.
Yeah, so we model this in the simplest way that we know of as political economists. So we have a spatial competition in one dimension. One dimension is, are you pro or less or against environment? Are you in favor of more environmental policy or climate change favorable policy or not? And so there are two things that pull politicians. It's voters. So you're competing on this space for voters who have their own sort of ideal point, and you're trying to gather enough votes to be elected. But on the other hand, you have a party, or maybe your own position. There's some preferences that you're trying to satisfy that could be the party, and you're trying to solve this trade-off, right? And so the complexity comes from the fact that when shocks, these weather shocks hit, or the labor shocks hit, they hit both the voters, and then that has an indirect effect on the politicians. So when we look at the Democrats' sort of policy positioning in response to shocks, what we find is that in response to the sort of, we call it popularity shock, meaning that you have a shock in favor of the Democrats that would be induced by these climate shocks, these temperature shocks. The Democrats would move to the left because of that indirect effect. But themselves, they move their own other motivations for choosing their policy position, maybe the party, that would move them to the right slightly. And so this is something that we don't completely understand. But the way that we discuss it, and it's just really a possible explanation, is that as they observe these shocks, they think that the dimension of environmental policy is going to matter more in the future. And then maybe if there's a salience, then maybe you choose more moderate views relative to what you would otherwise choose if you, for example, were, because of your own preferences, a bit more extreme to begin with, right? So you may actually start thinking that this is becoming a competitive policy dimension, and so you actually start positioning yourself for an actual competition on that dimension. It's kind of, it's not too dissimilar from the Republican sort of deciding that they're, so outside the realm of possibility of winning that they choose their own policy position. But now it's the opposite, right? When this becomes a more viable competitive dimension, then you actually converge to the middle, right? So yes. So what I just described is the reaction to temperature shocks. When we think about jobs shocks, then we find something also interesting, which is that in this dimension, when you have green jobs shocks, so more green jobs available, and you know that voters are going to vote more for sort of environmental policy, then the politicians respond by moving more to the left because of the sort of because of the response of voters. Now, in this dimension, their own position shifts to the left very strongly in this case. And that moves so much that is actually counterproductive to their political outcomes. And this may be because they overinterpret, or they overestimate the response of voters to green jobs, and they say they're going to like it so much that they're going to have to like green policies. And so they make a mistake in a sense that they move too much to the left on these green policies, which is maybe some lesson, as you say, for Democrats or for politicians in general, to sort of have a sense of what the response of voters is going to be, and maybe they learn a bit, and then maybe they moderate their response. And so that's sort of the takeaway from that part. Now, for the Republicans, we have we find that overall Republicans are not very responsive to these shocks in their own preferences, but they do respond to voters moving. And this is where, honestly, puzzled us. This result puzzled us for a while, but it's there, and that's what the data says is that they tend to move when there's a pro-Democrat shock. They tend to move more to the right, which could be the way that we interpret it, and that's not incompatible with a model, a theoretical model, is that they just give up. Democrats become so hard to beat that they might as well just signal their true, you know, ideology, or they might as well just sort of signal their purity, their ideological purity. So that's how we interpret it.
It's even true.
Yeah.
I was discussing your paper with a good friend of mine in California who exactly said, like, as a Republican, you don't necessarily want to then compete with the Democrats you don't almost want to give in at all because it's a losing battle. So it's almost like you start dismissing it even more, which then probably also indicates why, if I understand it correctly, why Democrats can moderate their own position on environment because there's less competition from the Republican who moved further away.
So we don't allow that. We don't allow the responsive policy position, and this is just a restriction to be able to estimate this. You cannot, in the way that we written down the empirical model, you cannot respond to the policy position of the Republican as a Democrat. You cannot respond to that directly, but you respond to that only through the voting. There's the way that we wrote down the equations that your policy position does not directly respond to the policy position
Okay.
of the other party, but only through the vote margin. So that's it. So, but that was a very good question because I had to think about it because
you mentioned, like, we're talking about, pretty complex, evolutions of politicians, but then you kind of put that in your climate projections, which is what we discussed earlier. You've got these integrated assessment models, but temperature gets noticeably warmer over time, which then feeds into the voting behavior, which then you
That's right.
leverage for some really interesting calculations and simulations.
So we say, okay, now that we've estimated these responses both on the demand and the supply, and so we are kind of reasonably confident that we're capturing some medium term. Of course, we could always have a complete realignment of U.S. parties. That's not in there, but we project forward using different scenarios. So socioeconomic paths, scenarios that, and so we pick a very extreme one and a sort of a more moderate one, sort of a business as usual one where we just don't reach the sort of Paris Agreement targets, and we try to see under the two scenarios what how things change. And we find essentially a good way to capture this is that essentially the composition of Congress will change if nothing else, if only you have these shocks, and much more in favor of Democrats. And that's the primary reason why you get a pro-environment policy as a result of that, right? So we were able to transform this pro-environment policy evolution by saying, how much more likely are you to pass, cap and trade, sort of the one that was pretty close to passing in the early Obama years. And that would be about an extra 9 percentage points. So we'd go from somewhere in the upper 60s to I need another 9 percentage points. It's not gigantic. So you may take this result sort of in a positive or negative way. I mean, voters do react, but do they react sufficiently and sufficiently quickly to actually do anything about this? That is, I don't know. It's not like we are doubling the chance of passing a cap and trade policy, in the U.S. But it's increasing now. Again, this when I said the main reason why this happens is because of the change in the composition of Congress, with more Democratic Congress people. But the actual policy position of the politicians shifts a little bit to the right and this is a sum
Right.
of all these different
So,
effects
so
that we've
maybe
been
this was
discussing.
something I didn't fully understand is that like their position shifts a bit towards the right, but it's then still 9% more likely to vote for this program.
Right, but that's the policy position of each individual candidate. But because the composition of Congress is
I
changing
see.
towards more Democrats that always vote more for green policies than
Got it.
Republicans,
It's the
then that's
average
how you get it.
Democrat moves
Yes,
slightly to the right, but there's just more Democrats. Got it. Got it.
exactly.
Okay.
That's precisely that's
That's
correct. Hmm.
and like you say, it's like non negligible if it's like 9% and there's some other changes. It's
People have different
I
opinions on
I
this.
I,
How
I
you feel
tend to
about
take to
that?
take a slightly optimistic. you know,
It's a good
exactly. It's
way to
just
do
if there's
that.
other shifts that move the percentage, and you get a different viewpoint, then additional 10% can shift it from like 45 to 55. So because I think it was very close ones, like even with this Waxman, so it's like it was just
Yes, it
not
was.
that far off, and of course we've shifted, but
Right. This is the probability of passing, and so even in the to 2020, that probability is not zero, um, and this increases it by 9 percentage points.
by
Again, different people have had different reaction to this number. Some people are very
but
disappointed that
this is
it's
by
not higher.
2050, right? So this is in 2050 that it's 10%. So
Correct.
um, maybe
Yes.
just from my own curiosity, because I think I emailed you this before, is this like a linear increase, or does it really like happen towards the end where like people really start noticing it as climate heats up?
I would have to go back and look at the year by year results. I mean, at the end of the day, the effects are linear. It's just that it depends on when the underlying climate projections really show an increase in the temperature. So it's more depending on that. I should add that now we're working right now to add a part of the analysis that has also a more optimistic scenario for the green and brown jobs numbers, because what we used was the BLS projections, and this is sort of under business as usual. So we're incorporating sort of an optimistic scenario for electrification percentage, and so maybe this is going to induce some of the people listening to check out the new version of the paper.
Um, because you say it's increases by 9%, do you then calculate how many more Democratic congressmen we would have?
So under the worst scenario, then we find that democratic vote margin increases by 1.4 percentage points, while in the sort of uh, more muted scenario, we find about zero point 0.8 percentage points democratic margin increase.
I think this has been great so far because it's such an interesting topic. Is there something I haven't touched upon or a question that I haven't asked you that you would like to bring up?
Yes. I think when the reactions that we've had to this is that from what we've discussed so far, it could be that the reason why when there are these temperature shocks, people more vote more for Democrats could be for other reasons. That heat may be correlated with other things, with let's say crime, that change your vote for Democrats for other reasons. And so there are two checks that we do that make me very confident, or much more confident, let's say, about the results. Is that this has to do with environmental policy, which is that there's two exercises. So one is sort of a falsification exercise in which we, instead of putting environmental positions, we put cultural positions. And so you see that they're you don't find anything, as you shouldn't, because these shocks shouldn't affect the policy position in terms of cultural. You know, I'm not gonna give them names, but cultural, different cultural positions, and so that's more interesting. The other one that we do, the other check that we do, is that we interact the shocks with the distance between the politicians in terms of policy. And so we find that these effects of the shocks on voters are stronger when these candidates are further apart in the environmental dimension, but not when they're apart in other dimensions. And so again, this is to us that's sort of a sign that if this was in general voting for Democrats when it's hot, but for whatever reason, that you wouldn't see that. And I guess there's a third way, which is that we look at elections for not other types of elections that are purely focused on environmental policy, which are commissioners in two states, Oklahoma and Texas, that are in charge of environmental policy. And so we find the same effects there. And so that to us is sort of reassured us that it has to do with the policy position of Democrats. It's not just because they're Democrats.
Exactly. And I really liked also the Texas thing exactly with the commissioners, because it's only about energy. So there's no other dimension
Exactly.
that can come into place.
Yes. Yes. That's
So
right.
yeah, great. I mean, then I take away exactly like this is like this. There's an abundant evidence that it's a real result, and then seeing what that will give. So awesome. Well, then I'd like to thank you so much for your time. This has been great, and I think people will learn a lot. I know some of my friends and you guys were already very excited when I told them this is upcoming. So thank you so much for giving us insight into the drivers of voting behavior.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for giving us some very useful feedback for the paper itself. We'll go back to the drawing board.
This is the end of the episode. I'd like to thank you for listening all the way to the end. And if you have any advice on how to improve the podcast, or advice on future guests or episodes or ideas, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Have a great day.